Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this Island Conversation series from Island Innovation, following up to the recent Island Finance Forum. My name is James Elsmore. I'm the CEO of Island Innovation, and I'm here today with Zia Paton, who's a PwC partner from Trinidad and Tobago and the digital services leader in the Caribbean. And we're delighted to have worked with PwC in the Caribbean over the course of the Island Finance Forum to showcase the work that they're doing on this very interesting topic, which we'll be talking about today, of ESG, or environmental, social, and corporate governance. So Zia, thank you very much for being with us today and for having this conversation. How's everything in Trinidad?
Everything's great. Thank you, James. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today.
So for those who might not know so much about it, ESG, as I already defined, environmental, social, corporate governance. What is it fundamentally, and why is it important, especially for islands and for the Caribbean region?
So ESG, I imagine everyone's come across the term in one way or the other, and it really culminates the most important risks that we are facing as a globe and as a society: environment, climate change, social, increased polarization, and governance, the decrease in trust in major organizations like government and NGOs, and we're seeing increased trust in business. So there's a massive shift in the environment and the wider environment that we're facing, and the risks that we need to manage as a society to remain sustainable and be present in 30 years to come.
And this term ESG specifically, which tends to be something we hear more in the private sector, what is the difference between that and other terms that we hear a lot, like sustainable development? That's one that we use at Island Innovation, or specifically corporate social responsibility.
I think, to put it simply, we could think about sustainability as the umbrella. And we're most countries are signed on to, say, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So sustainability is that umbrella. And there are many other aspects of sustainability that we pull on to actually achieve sustainability. ESG being one of those, and corporate social responsibility, as we've known it in the past, being another. The major difference between ESG and corporate social responsibility is that ESG is far more specific, it's far more formal, and there is a push to make it far more measurable to address the real risks that we're facing. Corporate social responsibility has been around for many decades, and it's been traditionally fairly voluntary and informal, though adding significant value when corporations do undertake corporate social responsibility programs.
And would my understanding be right that with ESG, we're really looking at infrastructure, if that's the right word, across the whole organization and framework, whereas corporate social responsibility is sometimes a nice little project on the side as opposed to something that's embedded in the whole organization?
I would say traditionally that's been the case. There have been some sectors and organizations that have really robust corporate social responsibility programs that tackle those three pillars in ES and G: the environmental initiatives in their CSR programs, social initiatives in their programs, and governance initiatives. So we have seen CSR programs that do mirror ESG programs, but ESG, there's far more rigor. If we are following a formal ESG program, and we should all be, there are clear metrics and reporting guidelines within which we can be far more specific because of the urgency in needing to drive climate change, the urgency that we have to address social issues, and the urgency to build trust in society.
And so one of those terms, I mean, I guess we know that ESG has the three pillars, but obviously environment is something, especially island innovation, that we're talking about a lot. And in the Caribbean region, climate is a hugely pressing and relevant issue for all organizations and all businesses. So we often hear about net zero commitments by companies, or climate commitments more broadly. How do they fit in specifically within the wider ESG structure?
So net zero targets. So Paris Agreement set out the need for net zero targets by 2050. Here at PwC, we've set a target of net zero by 2030. And ultimately, to achieve your net zero targets, you need measurements. You need science-based targets and measurements to understand, are we trending in the right direction? So to achieve net zero, businesses and countries have signed on to formal agreements and are better understanding what are the measures they need to make in order to achieve those targets. So the correlation between net zero and ESG, and more specifically the E in ESG, is really being very specific in measuring how we are to achieve the reduction in global warming. How are we to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius decrease in temperature, or rather stymie that to 1.5 degrees Celsius, no more than that. So the net zero targets that we're seeing countries committing to and businesses committing to, we here in PwC have signed on to SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So our net zero targets, and aimed to be net zero by 2030, are being measured by an independent body. They're reflected in our operations, they're reflected in the way that we interact with our supply chain and our suppliers, and really clear measurable targets to get to net zero. And that's what organizations and countries are all working towards.
Would you be able to comment just quickly on the frameworks? You mentioned that there are these different frameworks or different structures that people or organizations rather can sign onto. Because I know one concern that people often have is greenwashing, the fact that organizations can make claims that are not necessarily backed up. So for me, that's a big benefit of this, actually being able to say, no, we're measuring them. But how does it work? There are different frameworks and companies can choose, or are there any that is used in the region?
It's a fantastic question, James. And what we're finding is that it's evolving.
Okay.
And over the past decade, there have been many frameworks and standards that have existed to measure climate change and to measure environmental impacts. What we've seen in the last 3 years in particular is a collaboration and a coming together of certain frameworks to become far more formalized and far more specific, as well as to be more overarching. So in Europe, we've seen formal legal regulations in place for measurement, and companies within certain countries have very clear guidelines on what they need to report and how they need to measure. Of course, those are still evolving. What we're finding in some other countries, and across the Caribbean is one example, there is no formal mechanism that legally they're signed on to. And what PwC has been a big part of at a global level is supporting the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, in developing a standard that gets rolled out across the entire globe. So companies, in March of 2022, they released 2 of their first drafts for reporting standards. And in January 2024 is the new targeted date for release of that standard, with some sort of transition period for organizations to get on board. An important thing, though, to note, James, is in one of our recent surveys, PwC CFO survey, 40% of CFOs are struggling with the right tools and accessing the right data to, in fact, report. So what we've been doing in PwC is really working closely with organizations to understand how do you report? A standard is set, but do you gather the data? Are you gathering the right data to measure and report? So there's 2 sides to it: formalizing the reporting and then getting countries and companies on board to actually report. And it's all evolving in the right direction.
Super interesting. Yeah. And I know that that's often a challenge specific to the Caribbean region, given the large number of smaller countries and territories of different sizes. Getting data and data that's comparable between countries, and I'm sure within organizations, is something that we've found a specific challenge in the region, but an important one. It's good to hear that that's being solved. So PwC is known for being one of the leaders in the ESG topic in the Caribbean region. And I'm curious to know, how long ago did that emerge and what did that journey look like? And how would you say, where would you say you are today as an organization?
Yeah. In 2019, at a global level, our CEO, Bob Moritz, would have set out the PwC network goals associated with ESG. And PwC Caribbean and our group of firms within the Caribbean, being guided by that, would have established an ESG leader. So Arthur Whiteman is our ESG leader that is based in Bermuda, established a team of persons to really drive an understanding of ESG within their specific territories. We have a net zero leader, and that's Jerry Mahon, who's actually based in our Eastern Caribbean office, to be responsible for the understanding our operations and the extent to which we are, in fact, driving towards the net zero target. And we are. From a client-facing perspective, we have been onboarding new skills, and we are collaborating very closely and deeply with the ESG leaders across our network. Will Jackson Moore and Emma Cox. Will Jackson Moore is our global ESG leader, Emma Cox, our global climate leader, all producing fantastic insights with their teams and sharing those across our network so we can bring them to our clients and support them in their journey. So PwC is doing, if you had to put it in two buckets, a significant amount of work from an internal perspective, our own operations and upskilling and decarbonizing. We're also addressing and looking at how we interact with our suppliers. So holding our suppliers to account and having science-based targets as well. And then, of course, supporting our clients, supporting that wider community. And a big part of what we do is collaboration like this, like collaborating with Islands Innovation, collaborating with chambers, collaborating with the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and others to really be at the table to support what is just a global problem. And it would require global collaboration for us to succeed. So PwC is at the table for that too.
We actually had a question just come in from LinkedIn, which I think is very relevant at this point. So I'll introduce it, and maybe you can give any examples or wider experience. But I do recognize that for small companies, there is this challenge of meeting the costs and some of the complexities, and you mentioned the data complexity being one. And so what is, especially for smaller or medium companies, what is that experience like, or what have you seen as examples of that, trying to adapt to those potentially additional costs and justifying those additional costs, but also those perhaps other complexities such as data gathering? Yeah,
that's a fantastic question. So when we think about ESG, one of the things that we've done is really just widen the lens in how you think about business and how you think about value and revenue. In the traditional ways, we look at revenue and cost in a very narrow perspective. But what we are recognizing, and is backed by investors, because investors are looking for very clear reporting and very clear results in ESG, and we'll get to the question on funding, because that's why we need to drive some results in ESG. But the first part of answering the question is to say we need to put the costs in perspective. And when I talk about widening the lens on the wider value that your business or operations contributes to society, and whether short-term revenue and the short-term cost outlook is in fact the accurate outlook of your business. So one, absolutely appreciate there are short-term costs that you need to consider, but look at the long-term picture. And over time, taking the right steps over time is going to get your business with a wider view of what are those building sustainable revenue and being able to cover the costs of improved reporting and making different decisions in your business. I do appreciate that we're talking about ideal things. You know, tomorrow we can make decisions that are ideal. But of course, there's a transition. There are impacts and short-term impacts that we need to balance with long-term impacts. It's not easy, but having a clear strategy that looks at the long term and making the right small steps will get you in the right direction. I hope that helps.
No, that's really insightful to see that the medium long-term vision is necessary, but also that reevaluating the approach to costs and seeing where those costs also have, I guess, cost saving benefits in other parts of the organization is important. For any organization looking to, that maybe has no experience so far with ESG and is maybe looking to move forward or start to implement, I mean, where do they start? What are some ideas or initial points that you can tell an organization to, because otherwise it can seem overwhelming with all the different metrics and areas to look at?
Yeah. It would really start by understanding what your purpose is, right? What is your business purpose? And therefore, what is your ESG strategy? Understanding what ESG means for your organization and what impact you're having, not just internally, but what is the impact that you're having on society? And to start to measure that. It's the really, I think the really important progress that we're making in ESG in the last few years, in the last 3 years in particular, is measurement. Most of the conversations that we're having today, conferences that we're having, and a part of what PwC and others are a part of, is measurement so that we can make better decisions. So I would say that an important part is, one, understand what your impact is and start measuring those. Understanding, of course, and defining what that strategy would be. So once you understand what those measurements are, what's your strategy to address it? And that you don't need to do this alone. There is not just advisors, shameless plug, but a lot of collaborators and a lot of bodies out there supporting organizations and countries towards their progress in ESG. So to answer, it would be, one, understanding what your impact is, so doing that sort of ESG scan, starting to measure it, so collecting the right data and understand how you can start measuring it. Once you start measuring it, that's when funding is available, because investors bring funding to what they understand. So that's one motivator, if anything, to start investing in a better understanding and measuring your impact and your results that you're seeking in ESG. And then, of course, it's reporting would be really important and going to become even more formalized in time to come.
So looking at baseline metrics for an organization and some of the key metrics that are being used, I mean, again, just to give some more specifics of the types of measurements that are more maybe easier to take for the beginner and a more achievable when looking to, I guess, make an initial assessment for that baseline. What type of metrics are often the ones that are used across all the ESG pillars?
Right. So across all the ESG pillars, I would say, so there, again, an alphabet soup of frameworks and standards. If I took E, the ISSB standards that I mentioned earlier are drawing from existing climate reporting standards. And that's another acronym, just going to throw out there, TCFD, which measures risks that the business is facing relative to climate, and really broadly understanding those risks and the impact that the wider environment is having on your business. One statistic to share, in a PwC survey done this year on managing nature risk, 55% of global GDP, or US $58 trillion, is subjected to high or moderate risk or dependency on nature. So when a business if a business is measuring its susceptibility to nature risk, you'd find that you're able to measure where do you have vulnerabilities, and therefore what do you need to address? What are those risks that you need to be really mindful of, and how do you address those head on? So the ISSB standards setting out the risks and how measuring your organization's susceptibility to those risks is one part. The other part is your contribution to climate degradation, of course. So your carbon emissions, measuring carbon emissions across your operations. And there's some basic things, operations in terms of, say, travel, your buildings, your actual, if you are production operations. And there are many technologies and tools to help organizations gather that data and report that data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. So when you say the tools that are available, and I guess there's also other technology now being employed on this journey, what are the key technologies or available to help businesses on their ESG journey?
I'd put technology into sort of two buckets. The first is general technology that you're embedding in your business as part of just how do you deliver your strategy, how do you drive your business. And that technology should be supporting how do you gather data, how do you use that data, and of course, how we're using artificial intelligence to help with predictive analysis around your impact and scenario analysis around business decisions that you're taking that could impact society. So there's technology that we are embedding and using in our day-to-day business practices that we should be using to measure ESG targets, to measure impact on society. I know I've been focusing on the E, but of course, those measurements should extend to people and your workforce. Understanding your investments in diversity and equity and inclusion, understanding how you manage your workforce and create an environment that really helps people to thrive, and then governance as well, measurements around governance. So technology, and there are a myriad of tools that organizations are using to measure E, S, and G. There's another part of technology, of course, that can help us in this climate change journey, and that's climate tech. So climate tech could help us in three ways. One, it could directly help us to reduce carbon emissions. One, it could help us to measure, and the other is it could just help us to better understand what we're facing. So as of 2022, there was about $260 billion of investments in climate tech. What's concerning, however, is that the growth in investment in climate tech is declining. There's a 16% decline in growth in investments in climate tech when we are nowhere close to achieving the targets in climate reduction, in temperature reduction. So one of the forecasts that our ESG leader released in one of his recent reports is that we need 15.2% year-on-year reduction in climate intensity activities. However, in the last 2 decades, that's 11 times what we've been doing in the last 2 decades. So there is an increase in the pace that we need in investment in climate tech and other things in ESG that's really not at the same pace of the degradation in climate.
Yeah, it's definitely a big challenge. I think sometimes hard for smaller businesses or medium-sized enterprises when they're focused on their bottom line. It is sometimes hard to think about these big challenges that are facing everyone when at the end of the month you're maybe thinking about making sure that all the bills are paid and everything else. And I realize that this is often something seen for larger corporates or larger entities, but there's across the range of smaller, medium, and large entities that are engaging in ESG. But is engaging in ESG still a bit of a luxury for companies? Or is it becoming something that is really just necessary for any functioning company? Or at what point do you think it will become part of the necessary framework and reporting for all companies?
I think it already is a necessary part. If we think about one aspect, the S part of ESG, and the S part being the social, and even more so double click on social media, we're finding that companies and countries are now subjected to branding and profile, whether it is in fact a message they want to send about their company or country or not. So social media is taking interpretations on their own and really putting information out around defining what a particular country or company's brand means to them. We found in our consumer insight survey, over 72% of consumers make decisions based on the values that a business is, in fact, does it align with their own personal values? So we're seeing a massive change in how consumers behave, and that's just one aspect of it. If climate change doesn't scare you, then certainly from a business perspective, consumers are making decisions that are based on what a company's values are. The climate is important to many consumers, as well as other values around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of course, we know there's an imperative to attract and retain the right talent in our workforce. And again, another similar, over 70% of employees want to work for a company that has shared values, that are making a difference in society. And therefore, ESG is here. It is a must do. And I think if companies aren't calling it an ESG strategy, they certainly are doing things that are related to an ESG strategy. They need to quickly formalize that, take the reins, and not have it be sort of reactive.
I think that's a very good note to end on. And I think it's very interesting to see the direction of this from the private sector. We're often looking at this from the government and from the regulation perspective, which of course is important, but it's great to see that there is such a consumer-driven push to embrace these values. And we all know that for the Caribbean, climate is a critical issue, but so is gender equality. So are other aspects of ESG that come in when we're looking at corporate frameworks. So Zia, thank you very much for taking the time today. That was a very interesting oversight, and we really appreciate PwC in the Caribbean being with us through the Island Finance Forum as our lead sponsor, and having these continued conversations to build a bridge between our work on sustainable development, yours on ESG, and really show the exciting things happening across the whole region. So thanks again, and we're really happy to have you here.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for joining. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.